All right, for Read Aloud today, we have chapter 35 called Deasy's Tale, and we're back with Captain Hook. Captain Hook stood at the starboard rail of the Jolly Roger, a happy man. At last, he was where a pirate belonged, at sea in command of a ship. Granted, the ship had pink sails. Hook could barely bring himself to look at them, but he intended to fix that problem by stealing the sails of the first ship that he encountered, along with anything else of value. Why, he'd take the whole ship if he'd liked. Hook spit into the dark blue water. He smiled, imagining the terrified looks on the faces of those aboard the first ship he attacked. The word would spread quickly. He was sure of it. Hook was back. The world would quiver in fear. "Captain," shouted one of the helmsmen. Hook turned and said, "What is it?" The helmsman pointed to port. "Smoke." Hook quickly crossed the deck and squinted into the distance. It took him a moment, but then he saw it, a black smudge in the horizon. "Steamer," he said. "Yes," said the helmsman, "heading northeast." Hook rubbed his chin, careful to use his non-hook hand. He was surprised to see a steamer this far out to sea. In his pirating years, steamers had mainly been slow and fairly small coastal vessels. But no matter. Whatever had brought this ship out to the open sea, it was going to be Hook's ship soon. Its cargo, his cargo. He studied the wind for a moment, the direction of the smudge on the horizon, and noted the position of the sun, then shouted some orders. His men adjusted the sails, the helmsman altering his course a few degrees. "Smee!" bellowed Hook. The spherical first mate appeared a minute later, puffing from the exertion of climbing the ladderway. "Yes, Captain?" Hook pointed at that smudge. "You see that ship, Smee?" Smee squinted. "No, Captain, but I do see smoke." "That is the ship, you idiot. It's a steamer. That's coal smoke, you see. I've put us on a course that will intercept her after sunset. Cover of darkness, Smee. A sneak attack. They'll never know what hit 'em." Smee nodded, but frowned doubtfully. "Now listen, Smee. I want you to go below deck and check them prisoners, make sure they're secure. Don't want 'em getting loose in the battle." "Yes, Captain." "Check that pesky girl, too. Tell her to keep in the cabin until it's over." "Yes, Captain." Smee was still frowning at the smoke smudge. There was something troubling about this plan, but he couldn't quite think of what it might be. "Don't stand there gaping at me like a grouper," bellowed Hook. "Get below." "Yes, Captain," and Smee waddled away, still frowning. Hook turned back to look at the smoke smudge once again. It had already grown noticeably larger. Hook grinned. "They'll never know what hit 'em." And now we switch to another scene onto the ship that Hook's planning on intercepting. So we're going to kind of ping-pong back and forth for the time being. Peter, hidden high in the sails almost directly over Hook's head, had seen the steamer and heard the pirates' plan. "Tink, when you go to Wendy's cabin tonight, I'm going with you." Tinkerbell had been visiting Wendy after dark to get food and water. Wendy saved it for her rations, and Tinkerbell carried it a bit at a time up to Peter. "You can't go," chimed Tink. "They'll see you." She didn't mention her other reason, which was that she liked having Peter all to herself away from that girl. "I have to go," said Peter. "I need to warn Wendy that Hook's planning to attack the ship." "Why?" said Tinkerbell. Peter didn't actually have a good reason. He was bored from being stuck in his hiding place, and he wanted to see Wendy. "Just in case something happens," he said. Tinkerbell made a disgusted face and chimed, "You just want to see the girl." "Don't be silly," said Peter. "I'm not being silly. You're the one who's going to get himself killed by Hook." Peter smiled. "He already killed me, remember?" Tinkerbell made a disgusted sound and turned her back and refused to talk to Peter again until nightfall. So I had that wrong. We were with Peter and Tinkerbell. Now we're going to the new ship. Samuel Deasy walked unsteadily to the starboard rail of the main deck of the steamship Lucy, a 2,000-ton liner carrying 185 passengers across the ocean in considerable luxury. Most of the passengers, including Deasy's wife and her family, were still in the dining hall finishing a fancy dinner. But Deasy was feeling a bit, queasy. He was also annoyed by the disproving looks he was getting from his in-laws and his mother-in-law, who was not particularly fond of him. So he announced that he wanted to get some fresh air and made his way to the main deck. The sun had set and the moon had risen full and bright. Deasy leaned heavily on the rail, listening to the thrum of the ship's engine, watching the water whoosh below. He raised his head and looked out in the ocean and saw nothing except for a sailing ship. It was running without lights, but it was visible in the moonlight ahead just a bit to starboard. To Deasy, it appeared to be on something of a collision course with the ship. At least it would get very close to the Lucy. He was not worried. He assumed that the ships were aware of one another and the helmsman would adjust their courses accordingly. But what Deasy didn't know was that the helmsman of the Lucy had also had a bit too much to drink that night, and he was half asleep at the wheel, unaware of the dark and far smaller ship moving on the starboard side. Now we jump back to the Jolly Roger. "Captain," said Smee. "What is it?" The two stood on the foredeck of the Jolly Roger, watching along with every other pirate on the ship as the steamship was ablaze with lights, churning toward them, looking taller and more massive every second. Well, I was just thinking that the ship, well, that it's what, Smee? It's big, Captain. Quite big." Hook had been thinking the same thing. He'd never seen a ship so large as the one that was bearing down on him, nor one that moved this fast. The smudge of smoke that had turned into a tower billowing plume was gaining rapidly. "I was wondering," said Smee, "if perhaps we should maybe go after a different ship, one that's not so big." Hook turned around and saw that the men were listening with interest, awaiting his response. And in his heart, he wanted to agree with Smee. If he had thought of a good piratical reason for not attacking the steamship, he would have done so, but to simply quit, to turn and run like a scared dog, Hook couldn't bring himself to do it. He was Captain Hook. Captain Hook did not run. "Smee," he said, speaking loudly so all the crew could hear. "Yes, Captain." "What are we?" "Nervous?" "We are not nervous. We are pirates," bellowed Hook, nearly bowling Smee over. "Yes, Captain." "And we are going to plunder that ship." "Yes, Captain." Hook turned to face the crew. "Any man who feels otherwise is welcome to jump overboard right now." He glared at them. Nobody moved. "Good, then prepare to board." He turned to face the oncoming Lucy, which looked like a mountain moving through the sea. Now we go below decks with Cheeky O'Neill, who is in the Jolly Roger. "Do you hear that?" said Cheeky O'Neill. "Hear what?" said Rufus Kelly. The two were sitting slumped against the walls of their cramped and stinky cell. Frederick DeWolf and Angus McPherson were sprawled on the filthy floor, snoring. "Ship engine, and it's close by." Kelly listened. "I hear it. Sounds like a big one." O'Neill rose and went to the cell door. He grabbed it with his massive hands and shook it, but it didn't open. He cursed and then kicked at the two sleeping men. They woke up grumbling. "What is it?" said DeWolf. "There's a ship, and it's nearby." "What good does that do us? We're locked in here." "I don't know. Maybe they'll board us. Maybe the fool Hook will try to board them. Maybe nothing, but I want to be ready. If we get out of here, we make for the lifeboat. Don't waste a second and kill any man who tries to stop you." The men nodded. Now they could all clearly hear the thrum of the other ship's engine. "Very close," said O'Neill. Now we're back onto the Lucy. On the deck of the Lucy, Samuel Deasy watched with increasing fascination as the liner bore down on the sailing ship. Neither ship had altered its course. They were now close enough to each other that in the bright moonlight, Deasy could clearly see the men standing on the deck of the sailing ship. He could also see that the ship's sails were an odd color. Pink, it looked like. It was evident now that the ships were going to collide, and Deasy wondered if he should shout a warning. But a warning to whom? He looked around. There was no one else on deck. There was nothing he could do. Deasy turned back to the rail, unable to look away from the disaster about to take place below. Now we go to Peter and Tinkerbell. Peter and Tink dropped to the deck of the stern of the Jolly Roger, unseen by Hook and the crew, all of whom were staring with various degrees of fear at the monster looming in the water. "Where is she?" whispered Peter. "This way." Tinkerbell, a streak of light, shot down the ladderway, and Peter was right behind. Tinkerbell zoomed along a passageway and stopped in front of a door. Peter yanked it open. Inside it was dark. Somehow Wendy was sleeping through the excitement. "Wendy, wake up," said Peter. "Peter, what?" "We've got to get out of here now," said Peter, tugging at her arm. "Get out? Why?" "Fine," chimed Tink. "Let's just leave her here." "We're about to be hit by a ship," said Peter. "A very large ship." "What?" said Wendy. "Not very bright, is she?" observed Tinkerbell. A ship! Hurry, we've got to get on deck before... But it was too late. What saved the Jolly Roger from being instantly crushed by the massive hull of the Lucy was that at the last possible instant, Hook lost his nerve. With the steamship's sharp prow only yards ahead, he suddenly turned in a surprisingly high, almost girlish voice, screamed at the helmsman, "Hard to starboard! Hard to starboard!" And with all his strength, the helmsman spun the wheel to the right. It was not nearly enough movement to get the Jolly Roger out of the steamship's path, but it was just enough to turn the smaller ship so that the larger one, instead of hitting it head-on, scraped it at an angle. But it was a tremendous collision. For those aboard the Jolly Roger, there was a thundering crash, then a horrendous grinding sound, as the Lucy herself, barely affected, pushed the smaller ship violently sideways, as if she were a scrap of driftwood, hurling Hook and his men to the deck. The Lucy surged past, raking the length of the Jolly Roger's port side, ripping away pieces of her deck and hull. The pirates hung on to whatever they could grab to keep from sliding overboard, and the Jolly Roger leaned sideways at a sickening angle. Below decks, Peter and Wendy were hurled sideways, slamming into the passageway wall. Peter's head hit something and he fell to the floor dazed, but Tinker Bell was in his ear instantly. "Up and out," she chimed. Peter groaned. His head was throbbing, and he felt a little blood trickling down from his face. He struggled to get to his feet. It was difficult because he felt woozy, and something seemed to be wrong with the floor. He felt Wendy pulling him in. "Peter, are you okay?" "I think so," he said, staggering sideways. The ship is listing. We have to get out of here." "As I already told you," noted Tinker Bell. Holding on to each other with Tinker Bell lighting the way, a wounded Peter and a determined Wendy headed toward the aft ladderway. "What's happening?" said McPherson, struggling to his feet, his voice on the edge of panic. "We collided," said DeWolf, "and we're taking on water. Can't you hear it?" From somewhere near the cell came the sound of rushing water. "We're going to drown!" shouted McPherson. "Quiet," snapped O'Neill. He grabbed the door and shook it, but it was still held firm. His eyes scanned the cell, stopping at a corner to his right. Where the walls were once flush, there was now a gap of about an inch. "Come here," he said. "On 3, push like your lives depend on it. Because they do. 1, 2, 3. The 4 heaved against the wall, and the gap widened several inches. "Again," said O'Neill. 1, 2, and with a crash the wall gave way. The men stumbled into the passageway. "The lifeboats, and nobody stops us," said O'Neill. Peter and Wendy climbed onto the deck. The Jolly Roger had righted itself somehow, but was still listing. The steamship's long hull had just finished passing, and its stern loomed high above, bearing the name Lucy. Peter looked forward on the deck of the Jolly Roger. Hook, Smee, and the rest of the pirates were regaining their footing, turning to watch the ship that had almost crushed them. And that's when Hook saw Peter. For a moment, he stood utterly still, staring. You're dead. I killed you." He doesn't look very dead to me, Captain," said Smee. Hook ignored Smee, keeping his glittering black eyes on Peter. Had the boy's ghost come back to haunt him? But no, he appeared perfectly real. Hook started walking. "I killed you once, boy, and I will kill you again." "Peter," said Wendy, "fly away, now." "Yes," said Tinker Bell, in a rare moment of agreement. "Fly." Peter wiped some blood from his eyes, trying to force his woozy brain to think. "Peter, he'll kill you. Fly." Hook was only yards away, his razor-sharp hook held high. "Wendy, hang on." She started to speak, but her words became a scream when Peter reached behind her, grunted, and picked her up. "No!" screamed Wendy. "No!" chimed Tinker Bell. "No!" bellowed Hook. Ignoring them all, Peter took off and took 2 staggering steps, and with a desperate effort, leaped with Wendy over the stern rail of the ship, eluding by inches the furious arc of the pirate captain's lunging hook. On the main deck of the Lucy, Samuel Deasy had ran the entire length of the starboard rail from bow to stern, trying to stay even with what was happening below, fascinated at the steamship as the steamship's hull brushed aside and swept past the sailing ship. Incredibly, the smaller ship had not sunk, and now, as it tossed in the wake of the Lucy, Deasy saw an amazing scene unfold. 2 children, a boy and a girl, stood in the moonlit deck as a tall man charged toward them with a knife in his hand. And just as he was about to reach the children, the boy swept the girl into his arms, and as Deasy gasped, leapt off the stern. What happened next was so astonishing that Deasy nearly fell over the rail. The boy and the girl, instead of falling into the sea, began to rise. Their ascent was wobbly. It seemed to require a great deal of effort on the boys' part. But after a few moments, they had gained enough altitude to be level with Deasy. They continued to rise as they flew toward the Lucy, passing a good 50 feet over Deasy's head, preceded by a strange streak of light like a tiny shooting star. "Hello!" shouted Deasy, this being the only thing he could think of saying. The boy and the girl didn't respond. They swooped towards the bow of the Lucy, passing the funnel of smoke. Then they were gone, leaving Deasy to struggle what he had just seen. He heard a shout. It would soon the boat would soon be out of sight, but Deasy could see that the tall man was still standing at the rail, shouting at the Lucy. He seemed very upset. O'Neill, DeWolf, Kelly, and McPherson crept along the starboard rail, unseen or heard. The pirates were all in the Jolly Roger, assessing the damage. It took less than a minute for the 4 men experienced to untie the lifeboat and lower it over the side. And with O'Neill rowing as quietly as he could, they slipped quickly and silently away from the Jolly Roger, undetected by the pirate crew and their furious captain. Samuel Deasy, red-faced and disheveled, stumbled into the elegant main dining room of the Lucy, shouting incoherently. He was quickly surrounded by a curious crowd, including the steamship's captain, an experienced and dignified-looking sailor named Alfred Hart, who'd been dining with the invited passengers at his table. It took Deasy several minutes to calm down enough to get the story out, and quite a story it was, starting with the Lucy colliding. This drew doubtful looks from the crowd, as nobody had felt anything. A few guests went onto the deck and returned quickly to report there was nothing there. Captain Hart declared that such a thing would not happen, especially with a brilliant moon out. But Deasy was adamant. Not only had they struck another ship, but that ship had pink sails. Now there were doubtful looks to the amusement of the crowd. Clearly this man did not know what he was talking about. Deasy's wife and her family, mortified, tried to pull him away, but he yanked himself free and began shouting that 2 children had leaped off the sailing ship and flown aboard the steamship. At this absurdity, the crowd roared with laughter. Deasy's in-laws, furious, were pulling him away as he continued to insist that he had seen these things with his own eyes. He was still shouting as he was dragged out of the dining room. The passengers returned to their tables, still laughing. Now they'd have a fine story to tell about a man who'd claimed he'd seen pink-sailed ships with flying children. Of all the silly tales. And that's the end of the chapter. So there's an important chain of events here that will set things up for later. One, the 4 mystery sailors are now free, and you need to think about where they might be going in their lifeboat, what their options are, what are Hook's options now that his boat has been ruined, and then, of course, what's going to happen with Peter and Molly now that they're aboard the Lucy and they need to remain out of sight. So the author uses Samuel Deasy as kind of the eyes of what's happening as someone who doesn't know anything about the magic of star stuff and Peter's ability to fly. So you can kind of see just how crazy some of these parts are for the real world. So that was a pretty long chapter, so we're only going to do one today, and we'll read another one tomorrow.